Welcome to Careers in Discovery, your window into the world of biotech leaders. On each episode, we interview the industry's leading executives to understand how they built their careers, what they've learned along the way, and the advice they'd give to their younger selves. This week on Careers in Discovery, I'm with Tim Sparey. Tim is in the portfolio stage of his career, chairing, directing and advising several companies. We talked about his journey from being a medicinal chemist at Merck to a career spanning business development, CEO positions and multiple chair roles. He talks about moving from an operator to a portfolio career, how he looks at new opportunities and why capital efficiency is a critical part of biotech success, along with some of the tricks he's learned along the way. This time on Careers in Discovery, I'm delighted to be with Tim Sparey. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, great to be here, and I look forward to talking to you.
Yeah, great to see you. I feel like we should have done this a long time ago. We've had lots of conversations over the years, but we're here as we made it in the end. Tim, you're involved in several different projects, several different businesses across the sector. Tell us a bit about what you're up to at the moment. Tell us a bit about the things that you're most involved in today.
Yeah, no, happy to do that, Tom. And actually, quite a diverse range of companies and different projects and different technologies, which is, for me, which is what makes it interesting, working with different teams. So the two, just to mention briefly, one is a spin out from the University of Dundee. That's called Tay Therapeutics. Those of you that know your geography, it's the River Tay that runs through Dundee. So we thought the name was almost picking itself. And then the team there is very much focused on small molecule discovery against a range of different targets, but always the key piece for us has always been make the best, highest quality molecules and then explore the biology in specific areas. And that's worked out really well. And the business has been very lean, efficient, and produced three candidates in under 4 years, 3 candidate drugs in under 4 years with very, very little capital, about 3 million of equity, but with a business model of leveraging partnerships where we bring in license revenues. And we brought in around 8 or 9 million pounds from license revenues that have funded the next projects. Yeah. And then the latest projects, we'll spin them out into new cos perhaps, as opposed to doing early partnerships. But that, of course, depends on raising money, and I'm sure we'll talk about finances at some point during the conversation. So that's the one activity, and I'm exec chair on that business. Although I did start as CEO back in 2020 when we founded, spun out, and got all the foundational licenses in place. And Andrew and the team are doing a great job up in Dundee. So that's one, and the second one is a University of Cambridge spin out. That's called Concr, and we're in the predictive analytics area, using proprietary algorithms to predict the response for cancer therapeutics in clinical trials for pharma and large biotech, using our data sets that we've curated and accessing others, and also what we call developing digital twins of individuals. So not only can we help pharma companies pick subpopulations of patients, we can also do experiments in silico in individual twins of people based on data sets. And that's clearly an evolving field in cancer, and I think soon to be other therapeutic areas. And I'm non-exec chair there. I've been working with the team for about the last 6 years. So those are the two main roles. And then I do a lot of consulting for companies. Typically at the moment, it's helping to raise finances. Of course. And then I'll step in as a chair or NED or some other function. I've got 2 or 3 of those projects at the moment. Fingers crossed. Moving over the line with some funding in due course. Good to hear. Hopefully by the time this comes out, there'll be news on that. So lots of interesting things in there. As you said, they're varied projects. This whole piece around patient selection, patient stratification, understanding the potential effects of drugs in patients, it seems is where there could be a lot of value unlocked, right? And I don't know that we've quite got it right yet, but we're getting closer. But there's a huge amount of wasted research based on just not
selecting the right patients for clinical trials, right? Not on the effectiveness of the drug or the quality of the drug, but just on what happens in that one-off study.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the waste is compounded because it's not only investors or companies' money being put into projects that clearly are misdirected, but it's also patients who are being given drugs that will not work. Right. And of course, response rates in many therapies are 1 in 3, 1 in 4. And I think in cancer in particular, there's a much better understanding now about how you can select patients. But as an industry, we've been talking about having precision medicine in oncology for a decade. And to your point, it's happening, but I think it could happen faster. And I think there are technologies now abound that predictive analytics software like Concr and many others in the tech bio space are clearly helping harnessing the power of AI. But there are many other technologies that companies are using to try and figure out which patients will best give you the right answer in those early clinical studies before the costs really, really ramp up.
Yeah. And do you think it's the complexity of the problem that's meant it's been slow to get traction, or just like sort of entrenched thinking about how to run clinical studies, or what's been the kind of...
I think it's exactly those 2 points.
Okay.
There's a way of doing things that the industry perhaps finds it somewhat hard to move away from. Clearly, it's heavily regulated, but at the same time, new biology is being uncovered all the time. And if you look at the obesity space, the cardiometabolic obesity space, the rate of change with GLP-1s and next generations coming through in only the last 5 years, that's been huge. And of course, I think the industry is learning now that people who are obese will have a range of different pathophysiologies that will have to be unpicked as response rates are reflected and quite different across different people. Cancer is clearly a lot further ahead with a fragmentation of biology and markets, with ever decreasing patient populations being identified, which are still tractable commercially, but it means you can go into the right patient. And I think these other indications, for example, obesity being one, they will have to play the same catch-up game using the same tools quickly, because these markets are huge. And I think the cost of therapies and the size of the patient populations will be difficult to accommodate for many health systems. So I think that's another area that have to adopt these technologies very quickly.
Particularly if certain administrations request an 80% reduction in price. But let's not get into that.
So we could talk about that, but let's come back to it maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about Tay Therapeutics, I think fascinating story of that company, as you touched on. And, you talked about you're involved in lots of companies where they're trying to raise money. I think a lot of companies are navigating that at the moment. We're recording this kind of mid-May 2025. It's difficult. It's tough out there. So we've brought 3 molecules to candidate selection on £3 million of equity. But even then, if you add the partnership revenue, you're talking sort of 12-13 million pounds. That's, even with that into account, that's still really efficient. How's that been done? What's been the model there? Because I think the reason I ask is because I think over the last 5-6 years before things started tightening up, we all got a bit carried away with venture capital and sort of forgot about bringing in revenue and things like that. But yeah, tell us a bit about that.
So I've had the good fortune, this is one way of looking at it, being in the sector. This is my 30th year. So I have seen 2 or 3 downturns.
Yes.
And I think you have to evolve downturns financially. 2008-9, and prior to that, of course, there was sort of dot-com, and we've had waves in between where COVID was one where a lot of finance went into the sector that was not necessarily from the sector. And then now we've been in a difficult financing period for probably at least 18 months, if not 24 months, maybe even a bit longer. But I think you have to iterate not just your science, but your business model. And as you said, Tay has been very efficient, and we're very lean. We're a small team. We do use outsourcing to certain parts of the world that bring excellent quality, but at a reasonable price. But we have a core biology team in the company based in Dundee that makes or gives us access to key experiments in-house to couple with the efficiency of outsourcing, particularly chemistry. And then the team is prepared to make tough decisions. I think many companies will let projects go. We have stopped some projects, but we're also prepared to make tough decisions on chemical series, for example, they're not delivering a profile that looks achievable according to a target profile, then we don't keep continuing to invest. You go back to another series or be creative. I think the team has been adept at doing that.
Yes.
And the numbers that you've just reflected speak for themselves. It's a very efficient group from a capital perspective. And still, even then, with the license revenue, as you highlight, on a per candidate basis, it's still well below on a cost per candidate basis, the industry norms. And we know biotech can be efficient and lean, but we're particularly efficient and very lean. It makes it a challenge. It's a challenge to deliver, but so far we've done that. And with our fourth project being spun out now into a new co this month, that's in the cardiometabolic obesity space.
Okay.
It'll be interesting. It's a very early stage project, but again, we'd hope to be to bring the same level of efficiency to drug discovery and development to that project as the team have demonstrated over the last 2 or 3 years. And we'll continue doing that. And even if we do raise significant capital, unlike some companies that perhaps have made some difficult choices and some erroneous choices putting money into certain things, we will remain lean.
Yes.
And we won't just fritter away any hard-earned equity capital that we choose to raise. But certainly the business model, as we're touching on, was built for our time. Lean times on equity, partnerships, maybe earlier than one would like, but a candidate, good economics. We have a good partner in Tay Therapeutics, and they're charging ahead in clinical development. And it's a skill set we don't have. So I think it's a good balance between equity dilution versus partnering early. And that's really been my heritage on a personal basis. It's been raise money at the right time, but also partnerships can also help you achieve the same goal, but in a different way.
Yeah. So having real clarity on what you do and what your competency is, your core competency, and then shockingly managing the company well.
Luckily, there's a good team that do the vast majority of that, and I have to do very little, which is a good sign. Fair
enough. Well, you touched on sort of your journey through the biotech sector, and I'd really like to get more into that, Tim. Because you've been in the commercial side of the industry for some time, but you were a scientist to begin with. Tell us a bit about why science, why this career, what led you to the commercial end of things. Just give us a bit of sort of the origin story, if you like.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I think choosing chemistry as a degree subject was pretty clear cut. Just loving chemistry and always as a kid experimenting, creating fires and explosions with chemistry sets early on. I'm not sure what my mum thought I was doing, but it was certainly smelly and messy, but great fun. Yeah. It was always going to be chemistry related. And then staying to do a PhD was just perhaps a natural next step. But then it was either industry or to continue in academia. And although I was doing postdocs in the States, I thought I'd try industry for a while. And I was very lucky to get a job with Merck, or MSD, Merck Sharp and Dohme as they are in Europe, at the Neuroscience Research Centre. And that was back in 1995. So quite some time ago. But it was a fantastic place to be and a wonderful training ground with a great group. And we're working on diseases that still, sadly, remain difficult to crack. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and then a lot of the psychiatric diseases and other ones that still to this day often rely on old drugs, perhaps in new combinations and new formulations, which you see a lot of deals more recently. But it was a fantastic training ground. And being a chemist, I think, does give you the ability to look at problems and science and data in a different way to many other disciplines. And so I think I always try and get a little bit involved in the science, but most of my companies, thankfully, for the project's benefit, keep me well away from any formal decisions from the science perspective. But I can still see molecules and I can still get structure-activity relationships, and I think I can contribute a little bit.
Fair enough. So you spent the first 10 years of your career as a researcher at Merck, and then moved into a licensing role. And of course, you often see chemists picking up IP activities and things, which makes sense, right? It's about the structure of the molecule and that kind of thing. But how did that transition come about?
Well, I think as you sort of progress through the ranks in a pharma company, you're usually given teams to manage. And I think from a lab perspective, although I was reasonably competent at building new molecules and love doing that, there's nothing more exciting than making a compound that no one's ever made before, and figuring out if it's useful. And you always had the hope that perhaps a drug that you made yourself would get into people. which is a rare, sadly, occurrence for chemists, just because of the attrition rates. But as you said, chemists are adept at looking at intellectual property because much of that is based on compounds and structures. But I think as I was progressing through the organisation at Merck, one was being asked to look at projects from a due diligence perspective in CNS. And then your eyes get open to this world of partnerships, licensing, collaborations and investments. And you realise I realised back in 2004-05, there was a whole world outside of Merck that was equally as important to as the internal research, bringing assets in for partnerships and investment. And so I thought that would be a really interesting area. And I was fortunate to get a position with Ray Hill and the team at Merck, where the job was, it was called, you were called a scout. And it was literally a job to go and find, search and evaluate. There were 12 of us globally covering different territories, which is a market difference to most other pharma companies that were looking from a therapeutic silo perspective. We were sent out to look at all different disease areas from discovery through to phase 2, phase 3, and I was looking at certain parts of Europe and elsewhere, and it was great fun on the buy side, great fun meeting people, trying to figure out if their asset was A, in itself interesting, and then B, most importantly, relevant to what Merck was looking for. And we were the first to publish lists of areas and targets that we were interested in, and also the ones we were not interested in. So it was really quite transparent about that. And it really helped that interface between research and evaluation and then companies wanting to try and engage with, and it made it a more efficient process. But that was 3 years after doing, as you said, almost 10 years of science. And it was great fun. And a challenge to be out and about. You have to learn a lot of new therapeutic areas, oncology, obesity, vaccine technologies, and so on. But I love that and love being out talking to companies and also VC. We talk to VC and also academia about early stage projects.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to say, as you were describing it, that sounds like a really cool job. And then that led you into more of a broader business development role. And that often, you know, the thing we often hear from people who've got into business development is it's hard to break into because you don't have a deal sheet, right? And everybody wants a deal sheet. But how do you get a deal sheet if you don't have the opportunity to get one? But tell us a bit about that transition and kind of how that all occurred.
Yeah, well, I think I referenced 2008-9 as a difficult time from a raising finance perspective, but that was exactly the time I made a move into biotech. And I was fortunate, to your point, there is no easy answer that I'd like to be in a business development role, but I don't have the deal sheet. But for me personally, I think it was the track record of finding assets that came in and went on to be interesting from Merck's perspective. The least I could talk about that process, understanding what big pharma is like, what the processes are for getting through the sort of firewalls of big pharma as a small biotech, led to my first CBO role in biotech, which was with Proximogen, which at the time was an AIM-listed biotech focused on Parkinson's. The senior team was able to raise a healthy amount of finance, about 50 million, on the public markets, which is, I guess, did a few times in the last few years when the window has been open, but not many. But that was one of them. We raised money and were able to acquire assets from actually big pharma, GSK. I led those deals. And also from other biotechs and academia. And we harvested the ecosystem for good CNS first-in-class assets. So we built this portfolio and were very efficient in terms of how we developed through risk share deals with larger companies. And after 3 years, we managed to sell the business to a large US private that was looking for some first-in-class novel CNS assets. It was a great experience for me as a first-time play in biotech, and I thought it was easy after the first success, but we all know it never is, and there's been some challenges since, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
Well, yeah, tell us about that, because, you know, you're full of confidence. You decided, okay, I can run one of these things. That's fine. Tell us about the next part of your career.
Well, I thought I'd try my hand at having ticked off being a CBO. I thought, let's try being a CEO. What could be difficult about that in biotech? But looking back with the benefit of a few years' experience, I was fortunate to work under a very good chair, and I think I've learned a lot about the role of a chair that I'll come on to next. But working with Ken Powell, he brought me in as CEO of Q-Chip, which was a South Wales-based microsphere manufacturing business that was using a new technology. It was 3D printing. of microspheres in a way that could produce super high quality microspheres that could deliver drugs in a much more consistent, considered way to eliminate the PK, PD issues with many long-acting agents.
Yes.
And that was a great first opportunity, but not without its challenges. And I learnt quite quickly that sometimes as a CEO, you have to help build businesses, but you also have to scale back according to your need. Right. And within a couple of months, that was my first job, which was to reduce the size of quite a large business to make sure we could match our capital that we had, and then do some deals. And we managed to get to a listing that provided liquidity for my shareholders at the time through a concurrent merger and listing process that was a bit hairy back in 2004, but we got it away 2014, sorry. But another touchy time from a financing perspective, but we managed to get that deal away and got some liquidity for shareholders. And then I stayed for a year with the consolidated business to help do some more deals. So it was an interesting mixed first experience as CEO, but certainly learned a huge amount. And working under Ken was a great experience with a good team and a good board and some supportive investors.
Yeah. So tell me a bit about the difference that a good chair makes. And obviously you're in that role yourself now, but you had one in your first sort of foray into a chief exec position. What do you think makes that dynamic work or that relationship work?
I think you don't know at the time, as a first-time CEO, you don't know what a good chair looks like.
True.
But I'd known Ken for a while, and he's clearly an experienced entrepreneur, and he's had success and has continued to have success. And that in itself is usually a pretty good indicator of someone's abilities. And as you said, now in 2 chair roles, I think very carefully about what I learned as a CEO under Ken as a chair. And often it's the small things. It's a small, quiet word sometimes with you as the CEO or with a board. It's managing the board in the right way, particular shareholders perhaps. And sometimes it's telling people, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
It's been pretty firm. At other times it's just listening. Sometimes it's doing nothing, because if things are going the right direction, why speak up? And you can often see things being said that don't need to be said on certain boards that I've been a participant in. So I think it's those experiences where sometimes it's the small details, a nudge here or a word there that are really important, and it's guidance. And then if you come to the subtleties of the exec chair versus non-exec chair, which perhaps we'll come on to, there's some really important distinctions there about how you can help both the exec and the board and shareholders to make sure that the journey for a business, despite all the bumps and difficulties that all biotechs suffer, can head in the right direction strategically to achieve everyone's goals. And it's never a straight line, but I think a good chair can really, really help with that. And Ken did at the time. And of course, I didn't appreciate necessarily fully what he was helping me and the business to achieve at the time.
Yeah. I suppose from what you're saying, it sounds like some of it is down to really getting to know the CEO and really understanding how they operate, because I guess you want your CEO to be bold, perhaps sometimes bolder than they should be, or others might be more cautious than they should be in certain situations. And I guess it's about understanding the character of that person and seeing what they need and what they respond to, and what you've seen that they haven't yet seen, and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think one of the key requirements of a chair in particular, and also of a CEO, is to understand people, as you say, and everyone's different. And I think building company teams, it can often be done based on their credentials historically, their academic prowess, or their particular expertise in a discipline. But also the personality is perhaps the most overlooked piece. And I've learned this the hard way, perhaps in some organizations. If you look at various methods for looking at personalities, particularly in times of crisis or when difficult decisions need to be made, it's then you really find out about people.
Yes.
I think building teams of different sorts of characters and personalities should be integral to every business, but still I see groups not doing that. When you recruit on past performance in a particular role and future potential without really thinking of that individual, their fit within a team, I think that's where a good chair can help come in as well, to make sure that recruitment, in particular when teams are being built off of financing, is done with that in mind. So it really is about understanding people and what really drives people's thinking, particularly under pressure, which is usually most days in biotech.
No, it's an interesting point. And I think Something we think about a lot in our search business is particularly in leadership roles, although it applies in more junior positions as well. I think as we move into a world where the pace of change is accelerating every day, right? Past experience, while important, becomes less and less a factor in future success. And you have certain roles where you need certain knowledge and certain skills, of course. And it's not to say there's no place for experience, but to your point about potential and personality, the way, if you look at some of the stuff you guys are doing, the way that you develop a small molecule drug today is not going to be the way you do it in 5 years. And so it's about how well is that person equipped to adapt, to make the right decisions in an area that they don't really know much about. If a CEO is doing a good job, they're constantly moving beyond their experience anyway, right? So it's a really interesting point, and it's one we think about quite a lot. How do you assess the suitability of the person, not to the business that they ran 3 years ago, but to the business that you need them to run today? You
don't hire for yesterday, you hire for today and tomorrow. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think the ability to change and adapt as your science, data, and the market changes, which, as we know, it always does. And I think 2025 has been a year of change on a pace that probably no one's seen before, with macroeconomics and geopolitical changes. I think we've all seen points in time you thought, oh, we'll never see that again. But look at the last 2 months and the new pressures brought to our sector, yes, from pricing, from investment, from the whole tariff piece. There is a unique circumstances that make it even harder to get biotechs from A to B to C. So therefore, the leadership teams building resilience and adaptability is something that's so important. And if you have teams that can't do that, then it makes their ability to deliver even harder. And you can see that all around you. There'll be, I think this year, unfortunately, perhaps a wash-up of some companies that haven't been able to raise and have found it difficult. And maybe that's just the natural order of things. But no, I think having the right personnel, as you know from your perspective, and the due care and attention on hiring is so important to get the right people in-house.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it's a uniquely challenging time. I think, these downturns always leave the strongest companies standing, but I think there'll be some really very good companies that are left by the wayside just because of the market not being where they need it to be, and some that don't really deserve it. But unfortunately, that's the environment we're operating in. And then, so you spent a number of years running various companies, both as a CEO and sometimes as a CBO, before and alongside stepping into non-executive roles and things like that. How easy a transition or difficult a transition was that to go from, and sometimes at the same time, really operating a business to letting someone else operate a business and advising and guiding them?
Yeah, it is a difficult challenge, and it's one that I hope I was aware of, particularly with Tay, where I was the CEO for a couple of years before moving up to exec chair, and then the CSO, Andrew Woodland, who was an excellent CSO and has become an excellent CEO, which I had no doubt would be the case anyway. It is, so even there, I was in an exec role, but I think partly with that company, there's a geography play. Right. I'm not based in Dundee, the team is. And so operationally, certainly day to day, I was never intimately involved. So in some ways, it was almost a natural transition, but you do have to be mindful that, although you're on the exec side, you're still chair. So there's that perhaps difficult bridge the whole time between the exec, the board and shareholders that you have to be mindful of. And you have to make sure that, although I'm very much day to day involved with the business, you have to always sit with the shareholders and the board to make sure that the exec is being held to account, me included.
Right.
And so it is a difficult balance from that perspective. And I think invariably then you do end up sitting very much between the two. So perhaps naturally you're not intimately involved day to day, and the team can very much run itself with the appropriate oversight. But it is a difficult balance, very much so. And then as a non-exec chair in small businesses, it's always all hands on deck anyway. Right. So, what is the actual difference? And of course, there you're very much managing the board and making sure shareholders are are also kept aware of developments and keeping the exec held to account, but in a productive, helpful way. And with Concr, I think I do invariably sit on both sides again, because the tech bio space, like every other, has been challenging from a fundraising perspective. So it is all hands on deck. But no, and I think with years and wisdom, hopefully I've got a little bit of the latter driven by the former. You do realise sometimes you can just step back, and sometimes the doing nothing bit is the right thing, whereas perhaps a few years before, the thought that you need to do something is your first action, and not always correct. Not always correct.
No, and I suppose that's the challenge, isn't it? Especially people who have been a CEO or any executive role, really, tend to be quite action oriented, right? They tend to get shit done, quite frankly.
If you don't, then you're right.
Exactly. So learning to sit on your hands, I imagine, is a challenge, and I guess assessing when that's appropriate and when it's not, because there's always this balance, isn't there, between giving people the space that they need and then falling asleep at the wheel if you give them too much space, and it's difficult to know where to draw that line, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think with both my companies, I'm fortunate, although I've had a hand in helping to build the teams, and with Andrew at Tay and Irina, the CEO at Concr, she's excellent, and Andrew's excellent. They're doing a great job in tough climates. Yeah. And we're heading in the right direction with both companies, but challenges ahead, certainly, that I'm sure we'll tackle as a team.
Yeah. So you mentioned this very briefly earlier. I think there are a lot of people who get to a point in their career where they think, it'd be nice to build a portfolio and get involved in various things and dip in and out and advise and things like that. And you kind of touched earlier on the fact that it's not always like that. It is all hands to the pump, and it is do what you need to do. And I was interested to explore that a little further. And I guess to ask, when you look at these projects, there's obviously the advertised level of commitment, and then you now know, okay, it's probably whatever it's going to be. Is it a case of finding the projects that just you'd be happy to give that extra time if it was needed? It's just interesting enough that you want to contribute? Like, how do you tend to look at that?
I generally keep, and you have to think like an investor, because you're investing your time into the projects. So I have three very simple criteria, which is one, good people, two, good technology, that three, can solve an actual need. Right. Of course, that's often how investors think, in that order. Yeah. And some might change the subtlety of that order a little bit, or the ranking, but those are the basic essences of biotech. So when I look at an opportunity, particularly in this fractional space that when I look back, actually I've been operating in for 8 years, across these variety of roles, that's the decision-making process that maybe subconsciously you're making, but now I make very consciously. And if something doesn't meet the criteria for me, then I won't do it. And I'll be very honest with an organisation or a project, because I won't be able to help, nor will I be fully committed. So you learn just to say no sometimes, which I've done a lot recently. Yeah. But those are the simple criteria: good people, good technologies that will actually solve something that's there to make a difference for patients. Yeah, absolutely. And you're advising, including the two that we've talked about, but you're advising various companies on fundraising, on strategy, on all these kinds of things. And, fundraising particularly been difficult. We've talked about that already. And I know there are a lot of CEOs and executive teams out there right now who are really finding it difficult, who maybe it's their first time around or maybe not, and kind of have good days and not so good days, and it's difficult to know, right? They're heading into a lot of uncertainty, having to reassure their team while not actually knowing what's going to happen, and all those kinds of things. It'll vary, of course, from company to company, but are you seeing sort of themes in how you're advising the companies that you're involved in, or sort of what your message to people navigating that is? I think in the current climate, there are two things that I've seen, and hopefully I'm quite clear on, and that is clarity in your message to investors. Because investors are reticent about looking at new opportunities, particularly knowing that their portfolios need to be perhaps maintained from an investment perspective for longer than the original plan. Therefore, I think the new capital around is less. Although some of the numbers speak to reasonably healthy pre-seed, seed financings, it's often that difficult bridge between seed and Series A, where perhaps a project is moving from lead op from a small molecule perspective into candidate and GLP IND enabling work to phase 1. But I think investors need to have a very clear message, and that sounds obvious, but it's so often lacking. When you look at presentations, you think, well, I can just about get this, but if I've spent a lot of time looking at it, an investor sees 30 opportunities a week, they look at it, they're just going to go no. And therefore the clarity is important. The second thing, if there's a difficult decision to be made, don't put it off.
Right.
If it's about lengthening your runway and it's a people question, you've just got to get on and make the hard decisions. If you don't, your runways are shorter, you're going to make it really hard for yourself. The longer you can give yourself to generate real value and get to milestones, the more likely you are to get to investment.
Yeah.
I think those are the two pieces: clarity, hard decisions, don't put off.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose that speaks to some of the stuff we talked about earlier in that, look at ways to reduce your capital intensity, right? Because I guess thinking about it, some investors are biotech specialists. A lot are biotech specialists within a more generalist fund. And I suppose with that in mind, you're kind of competing against software companies, for example, that need a smaller seed round, can start generating revenue, then are raising, let's say, $10 million to go and scale globally with customers, with traction, with sort of case studies in place. Whereas the capital intensity in biotech means that you're still very far away from that. And so it's not just competing against other biotech companies, it's competing against, well, where else could these people put their money? And I guess the more you can't ever eliminate that difference in business model, but the more you can reduce that difference, the more compelling a case you can make to an investor.
I think absolutely. And also, as we touched on earlier, there's usually more than one way to get a company from A to B. It could be a financing, but it may be that a partnership through some sort of option arrangement, or one that you could perhaps trade some geographic rights for some financing to help take the project forward, or bring a partner on board for other reasons. That could be a different way of getting to the same end goal that perhaps might not be a big exit in the near term, but it could lead to a better return for shareholders and investors longer term. So I think it's being flexible as well. And I think we're seeing in the current climate, many more companies that I've seen are thinking about partnerships and ways of doing that, as opposed to raising capital, which is hard to get. But you are getting it. It could be quite expensive capital from a dilution perspective, which is just the way the market is at the moment. So I think the message is be flexible, be creative, and then maybe there's a different way of getting to that same end goal.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we've been looking quite a lot recently at, for various reasons, companies in Sweden and Denmark, and they've always had a very distinct investment environment in that they have investors who really only invest in that region. And they're not big ticket investors. They have a limited amount of capital just because of the economics of that region. And there's a lot of companies that are clinical and commercial stage companies that primarily operate through partnerships in that area of the world. And we've also seen that recently some of them you're not licensing your molecule forever necessarily. A lot of them are bringing them back from their partners after a certain term has expired, but there's now traction and there's now a market presence and it's now a commercial drug, which it wasn't when they licensed it out. So it's interesting to see those dynamics in different parts of the world where fundraising has always been a little bit more challenging. Yeah,
I think you're right. You've identified certain parts of Europe with near neighbours, and the financing climate, not the same amounts of capital perhaps as the UK, and therefore with those capital constraints, companies have always learned to be creative, as you say, through partnerships. And I think so certain parts of Europe, and particularly the UK, can learn from that, where the UK has been blessed with good amounts of capital at various points in time. But as we know right now, there are difficulties finding capital, particularly for early stage companies, especially here in the UK. So be creative, learn from others.
Yeah. And outside of fundraising, looking at sort of your career as a whole, Tim, and I appreciate we're compressing into a very small period of time, but I guess if you bumped into yourself back at Merck in those early days, and you could give yourself one piece of advice that you've picked up over the years, what do you think that might be?
Say yes.
Say yes. Okay.
So opportunities that perhaps came along, maybe to work in the US for a while, had that opportunity, didn't do that. Opportunities to work internationally in Europe, perhaps since then as well, where you thought, well, maybe it wasn't the right time for other reasons. But I think say yes. Certainly say yes now to opportunities that perhaps had different constraints before that now are more possible. So yeah, just say yes. Don't be afraid of looking at stuff that maybe perhaps daunting at first, but as you get older and wiser, you realise that most things aren't, and embracing them and trying them. Even if you don't succeed, you'll learn a lot and you'll be ready for the next challenge. But with the right help and expertise and guidance from good chairs and so on, exec teams can benefit from that and be successful. But no, I would say just say yes more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. Tim, it's been great to talk to you about all of this. Thank you so much for sharing with us, and thank you for your time.
Pleasure, Tom, and it's always fun talking to you about different aspects of the sector, and I look forward to further conversations in the future.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe and share it with someone else you think will benefit. And for more podcasts, videos, blogs and insights, come follow me, Tom Froggatt, on LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Medium or TikTok. See you next time.